Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about the possibility of Breath of the Wild 2 launching alongside new hardware next year from Nintendo. Could this be happening? Are there rumors suggesting so? Is there evidence suggesting so? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me first very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out, it is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe or perhaps consider joining as a member. So firstly, let me just say I'm undecided on this topic. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. In my opinion, I think it can kind of go either way. I think there's evidence suggesting both sides here. There's this rumor that I saw initially on Nintendo Prime's channel, so I'll link that in the description below, but there's also this Twitter post of it, and it talks about a number of things. It talks about there perhaps being a Nintendo Switch coming out next year with Breath of the Wild, with the NVIDIA chip and the DLSS 4K capability, it being similar to a new 3DS-like jump from the 3DS, where there's going to be improved visuals and capabilities and a better overall system with themes and things of that nature and Street Pass, but it also will have some exclusive games, but they'll still try and have like Street Pass and things of that nature also working on the base Switch, but there may be some performance issues. It talks about maybe upscaling some games to 4K, things of that nature. And all these things all sound well and good, and I think they make sense. The fact of the matter is, this is a rumor, and the thing that doesn't make sense to me is that while there's a lot of things in this rumor that do seem to sort of add up, coming out next year seems kind of too soon when you consider that Nintendo Switch OLED came out just last October. If you look at how Nintendo's handled things on the Switch came out early 2017, Switch Lite came out 2.5 years later, and then Switch OLED came out 25 months later. So some people might say, well, it could make sense because a 2-year gap could happen at the end of 2023. Sure, it could, but the issue here is that Breath of the Wild 2 is a big Zelda game. There is a history of Nintendo using big Zelda releases to push new hardware. Look at Link's Awakening Remake on the Switch Lite, Majora's Mask 3D, and the new Nintendo 3DS. The Nintendo Switch itself and Breath of the Wild. When they even announced the Wii U, they still put out a brand new tech demo, and then of course, with the Wii, it was Twilight Princess. There is a history here of using Zelda to push and market new hardware, so it does make sense to use Breath of the Wild 2 to push new hardware if it is coming out sometime next year, but Nintendo has given us a spring 2023 timing, and with that additional specificity, that does suggest that it probably will not get delayed, especially when you consider that we recently got a leak of actual voice work being done. So if voice work is being done now, the game probably would have been ready by the holiday. So it seems really unlikely that they would push the release of Breath of the Wild 2 all the way up to the holiday of next year just for a new system to come out if the game is already pretty much done and ready to go. But maybe they're not. Maybe this new hardware is coming out spring 2023 alongside Breath of the Wild 2, which would be a much shorter gap compared to the gaps of Switch Lite and Switch OLED and the Switch itself. It would be about 1.5 years as opposed to somewhere between 2 and 2.5 years. So it would be the shortest gap yet we've seen for a new hardware of the Switch family, or perhaps the next generation of the Switch family. But again, you can look at this voice actor leak from another perspective here. Why would Nintendo push Breath of the Wild 2 to spring if the game's basically already done, as suggested by the voice acting leak? Potentially because they have new hardware and they want a version ready for that system this spring, and that's what they're doing, very similar to how they handled the situation with Breath of the Wild and the Wii U and Nintendo Switch. That's a possibility because we've seen it done before. But this is also a unique situation. Back then, the Wii U was entirely dead. There wasn't really too much reason to put out a big game on that system because it wasn't going to do much for them. Putting it on the Nintendo Switch as a launch title has meant the world. The Nintendo Switch could end up being their best-selling console of all time. It is putting out incredible numbers. We just got the financial report. Last year, they sold about $235 million in software, which is the most they've ever sold in software in a year for a system ever. So, starting off strong with Breath of the Wild was obviously a great decision, and also Breath of the Wild itself doing incredibly well in terms of sales. It's one of the best-selling games on Switch, and it is by far the best-selling Zelda game. So it made tons of sense, and it worked out really well for them to do that. But on that note, currently the Switch is doing really well. Numbers are strong. Nintendo is forecasting a bit of a drop next year, but it's not a significant drop. Typically, the way Nintendo has handled things in the past, they sort of ride out the success of whatever system they have, and then once that system is dying out, sales are very poor, they move on to their next system. And that could be why analysts are predicting that we won't be seeing the next generation of Switch until 2024, because right now sales are pretty strong and they're only starting to dip. But there's a few things from the recent financials and the Q&A that could be suggesting otherwise. So Nintendo's president Furukawa was asked about the potential transition from Switch to the next generation, and this was part of his response. The question of whether we will be able to just as smoothly transition from Nintendo Switch to next generation of hardware is a major concern for us. Based on our experiences with the Wii, Nintendo DS, and other hardware, it is very clear that one of the major obstacles is how to easily transition from one hardware to the next. To help alleviate this risk, we are focusing on building long-term relationships with our customers. While we will continue launching new software on the Nintendo Switch, we will also provide services that also use Nintendo accounts and other IP outside of gaming software. We intend for this to help build a lasting impact with our customers. So perhaps obviously you can interpret this information in various ways. But what I took from this is that Nintendo is definitely thinking about how they're going to do their transition this time, and it's going to be handled differently. As suggested before, previous generations, Nintendo has waited till those systems have been pretty much dead before they move on. With the Nintendo Wii, there was really only strong software support between its launch all the way up until the end of 2010. The year of 2011 was sparse until the release of Skyward Sword, which, by the way, did not sell nearly as well as Nintendo would have wanted, only about half the sales of Twilight Princess. And then after that, we waited a whole other year where it was very sparse before we saw the release of the Wii U, which failed miserably. And there are some interesting parallels between the Nintendo Wii and the Nintendo Switch. Both of these systems are home consoles, sort of, that have sold above 100 million. And they both have seen incredible success and have appealed to a very large market. But with the Nintendo Wii, Nintendo waited too long, and they were not able to maintain that audience. But with the Switch, they're going strong for an even longer amount of time, software is selling incredibly well, it's looking like they can maintain a similar level of popularity and success for at least a few more years. But I don't think Nintendo wants for this to end after a couple years. They want this to continue moving forward. Which is why I sort of talked about the rumor earlier, not just to sort of bring up this possibility of Breath of the Wild 2 and a new Switch launching alongside of each other next year, because Nintendo's thinking of different ways to have a healthy transition. Perhaps one of the ways to have a healthy transition isn't just to have backwards compatibility and bringing along the Nintendo Online service to the next system and things of that nature, which I think would all be well and good and they should definitely do. I think also part of it might be releasing the system sooner than later. And that makes me question why these analysts are saying what they're saying. And just for the record, I'm not trying to say that these analysts are entirely wrong. They could very well be right. But in my long history of paying attention to the gaming industry, I've seen a lot of analysts be wrong about Nintendo too. And I'm curious why these analysts are saying what they're saying. Are they saying this because that's simply what the statistics suggest? Are they saying this because that's what the statistics suggest when you compare it to the history of Nintendo? Because right now I'm anticipating that Nintendo will be doing something slightly different. So perhaps Nintendo doesn't want to wait until that bit of a dip becomes a very big dip. Perhaps they want to maintain a similar level of success year by year by year. One way they can do this is by transitioning to the next system, but ensuring it's a seamless transition. Making sure games come out on Switch, but also come out on the new Switch as well. Making sure the online service works across both platforms. Making sure the games on the new Switch are backwards compatible with the old Switch, and perhaps there may even be some forwards compatibility as well, implying that new games coming out for the new Switch also still work for base Switch as well. They basically just work on both systems. They may do this for a while. These are all possibilities, It's not too different from how both Sony and Microsoft are treating their transitions, and things are going pretty well for them. So with that all in mind, I don't think it's a stretch to think Nintendo's going to try and do something a little different compared to the past where they have failed. And to further support this idea, according to Takashi Mochizuki, President Furukawa declined to comment when he was asked about plans to release a new Switch hardware this fiscal year. So what's interesting about that is that a couple years ago, when there was no Switch hardware coming out, he clearly said that there would not be back in 2020. But in 2021, when it was for Switch OLED, he did not decline. And guess what happened? Well, we got Switch OLED. So the implication here is that if Furukawa was not outright saying there will not be new hardware, there could very well be new hardware. And when you consider these rumors, and when you consider the leak of the Nvidia chip, and when you consider that Breath of the Wild 2 got mysteriously delayed to spring 2023, even though there are voice actor leaks suggesting the game is very far along and probably could have been ready for this holiday, and that History of Zelda always being used to push hardware, it might be the case that new hardware could be coming out next year. While it would be a shorter gap compared to Switch OLED and Switch Lite, when you compare it to the situation with the 3DS where there were systems coming out every 13 to 15 months or so, it's not that much of a stretch. I could see it happen. I'm still skeptical, obviously, because I still think it's kind of soon, and Switch sales are still really strong, but maybe Nintendo wants to beat us to the punch, or they just don't want to find themselves in a situation where there is a dip, and they're going to make sure they do things in a way where, even if they do come out with a next generation system next year, they're not making new fans feel burned or scorned in any way. Now, this is just my opinion here, but I personally think it would make more sense to come out with new hardware for the holiday because, one, yes, historically speaking, things sell better during the holidays, but it's not the main point here because we've seen throughout this Switch generation things seem to sell regardless of when they come out. But it's more so having to do with, I guess, not making fans upset, because think of it this way. If you come out with a new system shortly after Christmas, say you announce it in January after people have already made their holiday purchases, well, I think some people are probably going to be upset. They'll be like, oh, well, I just bought the Switch. I can't believe a new system's coming out already. And this happens all the time with all sorts of devices. It's not really anything too crazy, but considering that companies usually prefer to have their biggest releases come out during the holiday, I think that kind of makes more sense too. So again, I'm not sure we see new hardware come out next spring. But the ultimate point I'm trying to make here is that I think there are arguments on both sides, and that I am undecided on this issue. I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't think really anyone knows. Nintendo themselves might not even know yet either, because this is a fluid process. They're probably trying to figure out if they can even do it. Let's keep in mind, there is still this big shortage of semiconductors and chips and such, so it might not even be feasible to get out a new system in time for next spring. But we'll see. What do you guys think is going to happen? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.